So I am happy to be with you all here today. My name is Sarah McCullough. I am the Associate Director at the Feminist Research Institute. And today I want to share some thoughts about how to create an anti-racist lab and what that can look like. I am a cultural studies scholar who specializes in thinking about the relationship between science, medicine, and culture. And this workshop is really coming out of that literature coming from the fields of science and technology studies, feminist studies, and ethnic studies. And these are all fields that have really specialized in thinking about how does power operate, and what can we do to shift power dynamics. And in this case, we'll be thinking of that within the context of the lab. I am also a fourth generation Mexican American. I both identify as white and Chicana. I do have a history. My family, did attend college. I'm not first generation. And because of my particular identity, I have spent a lot of time not only studying this topic, but also listening to people whose experiences are different than mine. And so we'll be sharing some links in the chat, acknowledging some of the amazing scholars whose work this workshop relies upon. And at the end, I'll be sharing a whole list of readings and resources that back up and provide more context for what I'll be sharing today. The agenda for today, first, we're going to be talking a bit about assumptions. And by assumptions, I mean the things we are not necessarily going to talk about in this workshop, but that this workshop rests on. Then we'll be talking specifically about what do inclusive lab practices look like and providing some examples. Then I'll be providing you with some guidance on how to make an action plan for change. You will be able to take that information and move into facilitated group discussions. We have 6 really wonderful facilitators with us today who will help guide you through the process of making an action plan. And then we'll come back together for a closing and evaluation. If there's any questions or clarifications now or at any time, please go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand. And I'm happy to address that. Please do know if you raise your hand during this main portion, you will be recorded though. So just FYI. So the assumptions that we're working with moving into this workshop are one, that lack of diversity within biomedical research and STEM research more broadly is due to systemic deficits. This is a framework that I want to bring in as sort of you could say both a contrary, but also a complementary framework to a focus on the individual and individual deficits, whether that's the deficits of people who have power, say engaging in microaggressions and implicit bias, something that we very much want to attend to, and there's a lot of good work being done around that. And also in contrast to some frameworks that sometimes see the deficit as falling upon those that aren't part of as represented in the system. Sort of like, oh, well, we just, people need to try harder, they need to stick it out. We just focus, we provide, we need to teach people to do better mentoring or better learn how the system works better. These things, again, are also all true, but both of these focus on more on the individual level and what is sort of implicitly, quote unquote, wrong with individuals and what they should be doing differently. And that's all, fine and good, but we'll be thinking more about, what's happening in the system that is actually creating more opportunities for individuals to be seen as deficit, and how can we actually create a structure that instead encourages something that opens up more space for people's strengths. So that's the first thing. We're thinking about systemic deficits. 2, we also want to think about scientific deficits because we have a lot of evidence and a lot of research to show that scientific norms or culture are based in white supremacy, colonialism, and patriarchy. And if you have questions about these, you want to talk about them, we have some other, really great resources that we can share with you around this. One will be a workshop that's going to be hosted next month. And the other thing I can share is some links to other some videos and other trainings I've done that address some of these issues. But in a nutshell, really what we're saying here is that scientific norms and culture were based in a very specific group of people for very specific reasons. And those legacies, though we have done a lot of work to overcome them, still are present within our existing systems. And because of this, lab cultures can often be unintentionally exclusionary. This isn't to say that any PI is necessarily trying to create a feeling of not belonging within any population in their lab. Perhaps, I'm sure, perhaps that does happen, but that is certainly not what we're assuming for the most part. For the most part, we think that people are trying to do their best, but that exclusion is still happening. Because these histories of exclusion are not any one individual's fault. Like, none of us asked to be born into this system. We shouldn't necessarily, I want to help people not to feel a sense of like shame or guilt about any particular privilege or any complicity that they have. Instead, what I want to encourage is a feeling of responsibility to create a culture of greater inclusion. And so by acknowledging the systemic nature of it, we can say, okay, I didn't make this isn't my fault, and I'm still a part of it, and I can do something about it. And so that's really what we want to focus on here, is what we can do about this. Because, the sort of numbers tell us, I just picked a few numbers here to kind of demonstrate the part of the problem. We can see that we do have really significant issues in representation. Only 2% of NIH recipients identify as Black, and doctorate degrees awarded in the biomedical sciences. This is from a little while ago, but was only 4.3% Black and 7.2% Hispanic, people who identify as Black and people who identify as Hispanic. And so this is far disproportionate to representation within the general population, which tells us that there's a problem. And there's lots of, really, really important research demonstrating and supporting this general trend. So given this issue, one of the premises that we want to suggest is that we need to talk about race more, that race needs to be something that is on the table as a thing to be discussed. And students often want to talk about race. They see it as a problem, but may feel a sense, whether intentional or not, that this is a taboo topic. And so what you see here are some student beliefs about why race is not discussed. And this is from a study done by some professionals at UC Davis here about how to talk about race and racism. And these are quotes from students about why they felt like race was not discussed. They felt like faculty are not interested. Faculty don't think it's their problem or an issue. Faculty may feel too vulnerable to talk about it. Faculty may feel they don't know how to talk about race. They may fear that they will say the wrong thing, sound like a race or a bigot, or they worry that they will become defensive. And I think these are all, probably true for some individuals, or perhaps it's a matter of perception. Regardless, this is something that we don't want our students to feel this way. And we need to think about what we can do to intentionally provide a culture and atmosphere where students do believe that it's okay to talk about race. Your job right now, as we move into the next part of this workshop, is to maintain a learner mindset. In other words, just to be curious and open. Again, all of this is coming from, very deep fields of research, and to think of it as such. And also to take notes on ideas that resonate with you. I will be throwing out a lot of possibilities and very tangible things that one can do to improve one's lab culture. to make it a more inclusive space. By no means would I expect anyone to do all of these things at once. We are undoing literally centuries of oppression. The change is not going to happen overnight. What's most important is that we take one step at a time. And so again, take notes on the ideas that feel like they most resonate with you, that may address particular challenges that you think your lab has, or things that you think that you can help with as a leader. Because an inclusive lab is good leadership practice. We often talk about, creating a culture of excellence. The culture of excellence that has historically existed has been one that has been exclusionary. And we want to move to a different model that is necessarily inclusive. And this is just what we need from our future leaders, of course. And people who run labs obviously are in a very important leadership role. So I'm going to be outlining 5 components of an anti-racist lab. Some of these may not seem immediately applicable to race, but based on research, based on focus groups we did with students at UC Davis, all of these things came through as incredibly important to create a more equitable environment. The first one is equitable labor practices. This really focuses on the role of the PI as a supervisor, something we don't talk about a lot. The second thing is to have clear expectations, and often checking in about those on a consistent basis. Complementing that is 3, to have written norms, to write down things that may, based on one's own experience, feel just like assumed or known, because these may not be assumed. They often are not assumed and known to many graduate students, particularly those that that may be first generation or don't have experience in the specific culture of academia. 4, and this I think is in some ways like grounding everything that's come before it, is to have overt discussions about oppression. So in doing all 3 of these things, thinking about racism, sexism, ableism, other forms of potential discrimination and structures of oppression are absolutely necessary for these to always be on the table and always be thought about. And then finally, 5, to have measurable equity goals. And this may include specifics with any of these prior examples, but to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And here are some specific ways we're going to do it. And this is when we're going to look back and say, okay, did we do that thing? To reflect, reassess, decide if there's anything else we want to do. And thank you, Sarah, is sharing some links, some bibliography citations for some where you can learn more. And these will also be available in a PDF that we'll be sharing at the end. So first, to speak a little bit about equitable labor practices. What we really want people to be thinking about is, as a supervisor, your role is to ensure that there is a fair and equitable division of labor. This would be true in any case. It's extremely important, though, when working with graduate students and postdocs and others that are trying to advance their career within academia, because we all know that certain forms of labor are more rewarded than others. And so therefore, in an equitable lab, there should be a sharing of the quote unquote scut work, the work that isn't necessarily rewarded, the stuff that just needs to get done to keep the lab running. There was a lot of people also spoke to the importance of scheduled work hours. What this really means is work hours that take into account the broader lives that graduate students, postdocs, and our other employees have. Especially, given this past year, the upheaval that the COVID pandemic and many of the movements for racial justice have wrought on people's lives. There's a lot going on always in people's lives. And people spoke a lot to the need to have a clear division, be okay to have a clear division between time when they're working and time when they're not. And so this could mean everyone's there on the same times at the same days, but especially as we move into the new academic year and different forms of, working in person, virtual, it's good to think about how you can provide a culture that makes it clear to everyone when a person is working and when they're not, and to be flexible to the different types of lives and needs that people have. And finally, I really suggest that people think about periodically doing a quote unquote work audit. In other words, think about the different divisions of types of labor that people do in your lab. Obviously, there's like the research, the writing, mentoring, maybe service work, maybe administrative work, maybe cleaning, all the different types of things, or even like emotional labor, like who's kind of like, helping to care for people in various ways. And assess like how much of each type of work is everyone in the lab doing. And in order to recognize if there are some inequities, are there some people that are doing more of the labor that is always rewarded, whereas others are doing more of the labor that is not often rewarded? Because as many studies have shown, that unrewarded labor is often done disproportionately by women, by people of color within the STEM fields. And so how can we be intentional to sort of like check in about that? Another thing to think about in your role as a supervisor is how you can really make it clear what everyone's roles are. So to make it clear in a sense, like this is your job description. When you're here, these are the things you're expected to do. Here are specific goals that we as a lab have. It may just be as simple as making sure people are very cognizant of the fact that we need publishable data, and this is what publishable data looks like. And then they know, okay, our shared goal is to get publishable data, and this is what it looks like. And so therefore, these are the measures that we may set. We will check in and assess at a certain point, did we get this? Give feedback. If some of it is not publishable, figuring out why, what do we need to modify, and going on from there. But again, being explicit about that, because these aren't necessarily things that people come in just knowing. I think often as more experts in our fields, we can make assumptions that some of these things are known, but they may not be by those newer to the field. So this really complements the next thing I want folks to think about, which is clear expectations. And there are 3 areas I really want to highlight for this. 1 is within the lab manual. 2 is by having mentoring agreements. And 3 is in having clear expectations around author order by having some form of a protocol. So I think a lot of people may have some form of instructions about, how certain procedures or certain work that the lab does. But I think what's really distinct about the type of lab manual that helps to make an equitable lab is it's one that really is centered in the actual lived values of the lab. Every lab has values that are borne out through the actions of the lab. Some labs that may be to, like the highest goal is productivity. And productivity is always what's rewarded. It's always what's emphasized. And that can be fine, but it's important to be explicit about that and recognize that is the decision you're making, because sometimes, especially now, as there's an increased awareness of the importance of equity and inclusion, a lab may say, we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but then their actual actions are different than that. And so I really recommend, in thinking about your lab manual, starting with having good discussions for yourself, but also with your lab community about like, what are our goals? Or what are the values that are underneath those goals? And are those the actual values we want to have? And if so, that's great, but be explicit about that, and then review or build out your lab manual from there with that perspective in mind. And a really great example of how to do this is to look at the CLEAR lab book. The CLEAR is a lab out of Canada, and they do a really fantastic and really exemplary job, I think, of creating a lab book to foster an inclusive environment. So that's just one resource to look at. I get to do a whole workshop just on this, but I want to just point that out as an area that you can work in. The next area I want to encourage people to think about is about mentorship. Obviously, mentorship is absolutely crucial to the role of the PI. How we mentor is really changing right now. And so this slide really, really illustrates the importance of how mentoring has changed. When we think about 20th century mentoring, what we see is that it's moved from something that is helpful to something that is absolutely necessary, given just the changing nature of the job market, economic forces, and whatnot. So I really, really encourage you to think about what sort of resources you can avail of to yourself to help you improve your mentoring. We're really lucky that we have some wonderful resources here at UC Davis. You can see a link to those in the chat. There's, two in particular one in particular that I'd really recommend. One is a recent report that this comes from that I'm go ahead and posting now. And then there's another that Sarah will post that is really an exceptional sort of piece written recently by a UC Davis graduate student. The last one I really want to highlight and really, really crucial, especially for those who are moving on in academia, is having an author order protocol, having some sort of way for people to know, how do you decide author order? There's idiosyncrasies to how this is done across fields, I recognize, and that's why I think it's important for each PI to be really explicit about this. Graduate students may or may not recognize the importance of this. So this is, in a sense, part of the mentoring process in showing them that you have a transparent way of deciding what order the authors will be in is incredibly helpful. A few ways to do this. There's a number of different ways to do this. But what's most important is that you make the norms of the field and your lab transparent. This gives graduate students and postdocs and all your lab members the opportunity to make the best choices about how they're spending their time, and knowing based on that how they will be rewarded within the author order structure. Some suggestions that you can consider. Some people have published around point systems. Some people have focused more on different roles that people take. Some operate by group consensus. If you look at the Cleared Lab Manual, they have an example of that. And one thing that I think is, from an equity perspective, is always important to think about is to account for career goals and potential bias. We have lots of evidence of bias within the publication and review process. And so that's just something to also think about of how can we via author order counter some of those biases. When people in your lab really know where they stand and they really know what the expectations are, they're much more likely to be able to come in and bring their full creativity, because they're not spending energy trying to figure out what's going on and what the norms are and whether or not they're meeting expectations. They can just set all this aside because they know the answers and can more fully focus on the actual work, which can lead to better research findings, better results, and so on and so forth. And there's some really great examples of this that we've already seen. The other thing I should add to this too, that I haven't talked too much about, is how important how changing the form of lab meetings so that they can be maybe a bit less hierarchical and more transparent, more co-created with your various research lab members, can also help to create a help your research moves in ways that you may not expect. Finally, I want to talk about having explicit conversations about oppression. This is something that is fairly uncommon in labs, and that's understandable given the history of science. And so this is new. This can often be felt as very uncomfortable. Unfortunately, there are some really wonderful resources at UC Davis to help support you in doing this within the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office and the Health Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Office on the health campus. And so I really encourage you to take advantage of that. And I'm just going to give you a few suggestions on ways you can do this. One of the sort of easiest roads in is to integrate this into journal clubs, which many of you I know already have. And think about what sort of readings you can do as a group to spur these conversations. And this is just a few examples of things you can think about. We'll have you'll get a whole bunch of resources at the end as other potential readings. You may consider reading about health disparities if you do work around health, if you have other forms of disparities within your field of research, making that a part of the lab's discussion, even if your research isn't explicitly about health disparities. I believe that all researchers should know about disparities related to the research field, even if that's not their area of study, if nothing else, so they can avoid perpetuating some of the problems that have resulted. You could also consider reading research on representation in your particular field, just to gain awareness around what are the issues, again, to help you not necessarily to keep from replicating some of those problems. Reading about the history of the discipline, particularly around its complicity with systems of oppression, is really, I think, really, really enlightening. You may think, well, I don't know if that exists for my field. I can tell you based on my knowledge of the history of science that virtually every field is complicit within systems of oppression because of its basis in white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism. One of the only potential exceptions to that may be the field of ethnic studies. If you need a place to start there, you could look, many fields have a strong, or many fields have links from the early 20th century to eugenics. And so even just learning about the relationship between your field and eugenics, for example, can be enlightening. It's also helpful to learn more about microaggressions and tokenism, and to co-engage in some form of mentor training. Now, these conversations about oppression in an ideal setting will make your lab members feel like they can actually bring challenges that they see and encounter within institutions to the lab to discuss. And this may then lead to the opportunity to push for change in institutions. And so if your lab becomes aware of a challenge or something that isn't necessarily equitable within your professional society, you can think about how to organize together to make that change, make the needed change happen. And that ultimately is what really, really makes a difference in terms of retention, in terms of creating a more flourishing scientific community. So I have given quite a number of possible things you could do. So things you could do, the types of goals that you could create. One, you could consider ways of offering funds for lab members, either to address like systemic inequities or to as a reward for equity related work that graduate students may be spearheading, because I think, as many of us know, graduate students are often taking the lead in this initiatives, and that is not currently labor that is highly rewarded within the systems of academia. And the more we can do to improve that, is a good thing. You could make a goal to start a book club. You could set recruitment target strategies. If you see that you would like to have more diverse representation in your lab, think about how you could set a goal to make that happen. You could make a goal to attend trainings around any of these topics, whether it's around implicit bias, microaggression, more trainings like this one, perhaps trainings around mentoring. You could make mentoring agreements if you don't already have those. You could think about changing your lab meeting structure to make it more inclusive and less hierarchical, more welcoming for people to bring in their ideas. You could think about conducting a workload analysis, as we talked about before, a work audit about what type of work people are doing. You could think about creating lab values. These are really best done co-created with those in your lab. And revisited periodically, because as we all know, the faces in our labs, are changing as people graduate and move on. You could consider formalizing an author order protocol. You could work on co-creating a lab manual with your lab members. You could think about how to set reasonable working hours, or you could think about ways to organize for specific institutional changes that you may see the lab needing, or that you may see your lab has recognized as being needed. But right now we're getting to the exciting part. You all have been listening, and now it's going to be your turn to discuss. We're going to invite you all to move into small groups soon and to create an action plan. Think about what challenge in your lab could be addressed, or what is a vision for your lab that you can work towards. And ask yourself, to identify a goal. So think about, what is a goal you want to set? What are the processes or steps you need to get there? And what kind of measures for accountability can you create? Whether that's, that might be like timelines, that might be sharing your goal with someone else or your lab, a colleague perhaps, but having these three things: the goals, processes and steps, and the measures for accountability. So you're about to move into small groups. Each of your small groups will have a trained facilitator who's been working with me in doing these anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and really opening to create a more liberated learning environment and knowledge production within the university. They're all really fantastic, and they're going to help you. And what will help you all is if you all can move into that space with openness, honesty, and curiosity. Again, kind of just having that like learner mindset, to be willing to stay engaged, even through discomfort. I really appreciate that all of you have been willing to share what you are doing and what you aren't. Because in order to have growth around our equity work, we have to be willing to be honest about things we haven't been doing so that we can move forward.